Hello and welcome to the UKGN Network podcast. I'm Zoidberg. This week we found ourselves at the end of an almost decade-long journey that began with the release of Darksiders in 2010. This series of action games has told the stories of each of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and with the release of Darksiders Genesis on PC and Stadia, War, Death and Fury have finally been joined by Strife as a playable character. Whereas the first three games in the series were all third-person action games, this one is something more Diablo-esque, with the view switching to an isometric one and the option to play in co-op. While this is initially disappointing, it suits the game incredibly well, although being able to rotate the camera would have made it even better. The hack and slash gameplay has remained largely the same, although we missed the Metroidvania exploration aspects, as everything is now split into self-contained levels. You can return to previously completed chapters to scout for collectibles, but there's very little incentive to do so. It's also a game that has bags of personality, with a great script that has some of the best character banter we've heard in a long time. It makes for a very entertaining game that holds your attention, especially if you can get a friend to join you. Xbox and PlayStation owners should look out for it early in the new year. Darksiders isn't the only franchise that can boast about a successful change of approach. Indeed, some long-running series, like Final Fantasy and Zelda, make a virtue of it, where each game is effectively a standalone title. We took the inspiration for this week's feature from this. So here are what we consider the 5 best sequels that changed everything. Donkey Kong 3. After 2 games involving climbing up scaffolding and jumping over barrels, Donkey Kong 3, which was released in the arcades and on the Japanese Famicom in 1983, changed the formula completely. It now more closely resembled the likes of Galaga, as you shot bug spray to protect flowers from swarming insects, while at the same time trying to push the great ape up to the top of the screen. It featured a new protagonist named Stanley, leaving fans free to complain about Mario carrying a gun as recently as 2017's Mario and Rabbids, although he does still sport a pair of familiar red overalls on the game's artwork. Like many arcade games of the same era, there's a brilliant simplicity to the gameplay that keeps us coming back to it all these years later, which is something that we can do thanks to its inclusion in the Nintendo Switch's online library. Fade to Black. When Conrad Hart went into stasis at the end of Flashback, the developers could have opted to bring him back in another 2D platformer, and nobody would have complained. Instead, they came up with Fade to Black, and if it was a disappointment, that speaks more about the quality of the first game than it does about this one. If it wasn't for the instantly recognisable animation of the central character, you probably wouldn't have even known that it was a sequel. Playing it today, it feels very much like a product of the mid-90s, with its rotational tank controls and a fixed camera angle that obscures your view. Early sections are also difficult because of the fiddly controls, rather than the game design itself. We still enjoyed it back in the day though, and this makes it a game crying out for a remake. Grand Theft Auto 3. The first 2 GTA games on the PlayStation never quite achieved the potential of DMA Design's ideas, mainly thanks to the overhead view restricting most of what you could see. By making the decision to go 3D for the third outing, first released in 2001 for the PS2, they solved this issue, and inadvertently made one of the most influential games of all time in the process. This was one of the first titles where gamers could have fun doing whatever they wanted. Later sequels would feature strong lead characters, but this had a silent avatar for the player, later discovered to be named Claude by data miners, and many of the features that would go on to become series staples. Vice City and San Andreas would make improvements to the formula, pushing the series into iconic status, and the rest is history. Oddworld Munch's Odyssey. When it finally arrived in 2002, Oddworld Munch's Odyssey angered a lot of people by being an Xbox exclusive, and as a launch title for Microsoft's new console, it found itself playing a distant second fiddle to Halo. Although previous Oddworld games were 2D, they fit seamlessly into their world, and by opening things out into 3D, the designers managed to retain that sense of place. You begin by controlling Abe from the previous 2 games, but the real star of the show is Munch, who is a frog-like amphibian and possibly the last of his species. Switching between the 2 characters helps to keep the game from feeling repetitive, and the GameSpeak interface is as entertaining as ever. For the 4th Oddworld game, Stranger's Wrath, the style was changed yet again, this time to that of a first-person shooter, and the results were even better. Resident Evil 4. By 2004, after 3 main releases and the spin-offs Code Veronica and Zero, Capcom and Shinji Mikami decided that the survival horror genre they helped shape was going stale and needed a kick up the backside. The result was Resident Evil 4, one of the best and most perfectly paced action games ever made. Changing the look of the game from skewed camera angles to an over-the-shoulder view gave the enemy encounters an intensity unlike anything that we'd played before, and the first time we came face to face with Chainsaw Man made us drop the controller in fear. It would go on to be released on every single console under the sun, and spawn countless copycats. The success of this series revival gave Capcom the confidence to do it all over again in 2017 with Resident Evil 7. Now let's see what new games we've played this week with our reviews. Julian Gollop has spent almost his entire career making turn-based strategy games, creating some of the finest examples of the genre like Laser Squad and XCOM. It should come as no surprise then that Phoenix Point, out now on PC, is both brilliant and familiar. In purely gameplay terms, this is exactly what you'd expect. Move your team around the level, hide behind cover, and take your shots at the Pandoran enemies whenever you can, before the opposing team get to do the same. It's incredibly polished and there are many tactics you can use. Where it differs from XCOM is in the way that you can use your action points how you want, moving and shooting in any order during each turn. There are even drivable vehicles that are great fun to experiment with. Away from the battles, there's plenty to do as you interact with 3 different groups of potential allies, research new weaponry and plan your next mission. There's more than enough here to keep you busy for weeks to come. Demon's Tilt is a new pinball game that combines the usual score chase gameplay with that of a bullet hell shooter. As bizarre as that sounds, it works incredibly well, with the screen regularly filling with showers of pink bullets. This does mean that it's possible to lose track of the ball when things get too frantic, but there are a lot of graphics options that make it easier, including adding a trail to the ball movement. You can also try different levels of zoom and scanline filters. Everyone should be able to find their perfect setup. This has a lot in common with Devil's Crush on the PC Engine, putting more emphasis on being a good video game rather than a realistic pinball simulation. And that makes it stand out from the likes of Pinball FX. This is the perfect game to have in your library whenever you need a quick high score fix, and including it in Xbox Game Pass should help it reach a wider audience. The PC version has been in early access since January, but now that the Xbox version is out, hopefully it won't be too long before that gets a full release too. Shovel Knight is truly one of the biggest indie success stories of the last decade, and the generosity of Yacht Club Games continues to be astounding. Having already produced 3 additional campaigns at no extra cost to existing owners, we now get King of Cards. Just like the previous releases, it's a throwback to the NES era of platform games, with simple mechanics and a punishing level of difficulty. It really is impressive how the developers managed to make all 4 campaigns feel unique, with central characters that all play differently. The King Knight doesn't carry a weapon, instead utilising a shoulder charge which can also be used to gain extra height against walls. It also includes a competitive card battle minigame that's not quite as good as we'd hoped, but it is possible to finish the story without playing a single round of it if you wish. Even if you don't already own the original game, this is well worth the £8 asking price, but we'd honestly recommend buying the complete edition instead. We bring this week's show to a close in the usual way, with our retro game of the week. Vigilante is an arcade game from 1989 that has just been released on PS4 courtesy of Hamster's Arcade Archive series. To say it hasn't aged well would be an understatement. It's essentially a more urban take on Kung Fu Master, where street thugs are the enemies and chains, knives and guns are the weapons. You get attacked from left and right and must fight off your assailants using just your hands and feet. Unfortunately, the responsiveness of the controls means that getting overwhelmed by enemies is a common occurrence, and the speed at which your energy bar depletes is completely unfair. Even in 1989, this wasn't a particularly good game, already feeling dated next to the likes of Double Dragon in your local arcade. It's interesting to play it today, but it's just proof that some games are best left in the past. With that, it's time to end. We hope you enjoyed this week's show. Please let us know in the comments about what radically changed sequels you think we missed, or perhaps you could recommend a topic for a future episode. We'll be back next week with a Christmas special, looking at those games that added extra festive flavour after release, as well as reviews of the week's new releases. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe so that you don't miss it. You can also follow us on all social media at UK Gaming Network. Until then, thanks for listening. See you soon.